Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people that want to build power to make the world a better place, including community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. We develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Gantt framework of leadership, organising and action. And we also help folks craft their story through the practice of public narrative that connects people through their shared values and moves them to act together. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers. As Australia's #1 plaintiff law firm, Morris Blackburn believe the law should serve everyone and not just those who can afford it. Morris Blackburn have helped influence some of Australia's most important legal decisions, including equal pay for women and Indigenous workers, and helped over 500,000 Australians get the compensation they deserve. Morris Blackburn Lawyers, experience you can count on. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. Apologies, we didn't get our episode with David Feeney, our Hour of Power episode out last Friday. We had a couple of challenges at our end, and obviously this episode is dropping a little bit later today as well. We always try to endeavour to get the thing out first thing Friday morning, but we've just had a couple of logistical challenges we need to overcome. So we appreciate your patience. Today's episode is our annual budget preview. So we're going to be joined on the line by Emma Dawson from Capita and Ed Cavanough from the McKell Institute to preview the federal budget that's going to be handed down next Tuesday evening. So looking forward to that conversation with those two fine individuals. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. And be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast when you're done listening to today's episode and give us a review. And support the show by joining us on Socially Democratic Patreon, where you can access all show updates, new merchandise and more. We're going to be launching that in a couple of weeks' time, so look out for that. And for everything else, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Monday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. It's budget season. So we're heading into very uncharted mental territories for Stephen Donnelly here, and that's why I've relied on some experts. I literally feel like it's the political version of a Bill Simmons podcast when he talks about, he gets like pop culture experts on, and he'll just try and work in as many sporting analogies as he possibly can. I think I'll try and work in as many campaign analogies into this particular topic, but it's a very popular episode. I think it's our 3rd year running. So we're bringing in the heavyweights to help us prepare for the budget. So we're going to do a preview. Obviously, this is a preview episode, and then we'll do a review episode with the same folks next week. So I'm joined on the line by the Executive Director of Capita, Emma Dawson. Great to see you again, Emma.
Hey, Stephen, good to be with you again.
Fantastic. And from the CEO of McKell Institute, Ed Cavanough, who's been on the show, but not with me, because I think you did an episode while I was gallivanting around the world on annual leave. Ed, great to see you.
Good to see you, and thanks for having me. And excuse any slowness on my part. I'm just off the plane from Dublin, so I got back last night. So if I'm jet lagged, please excuse me.
Oh, you should have told me that. See, now I could literally do a whole podcast on best pint in Dublin that you had. What did you get up to? This could be a travel podcast.
We'll do the next one. Yeah,
we'll do the next time. Okay, great. No, but quickly, best pint. Where was the best pint you had in Dublin? What pub?
Oh, I wish I knew the name. I mean, I went to about 40. But what I will say is I'm shocked at how different they really were. You know, you go from one to the other and it was like a night and day. So I should have been writing down the names of them, but we'll do that by the next one.
And it can be fighting words as well amongst Dubliners if you say that's the best pint versus someone else, and then you'll get into a massive argument. So it's best to be the sort of agnostic Antipodean and not weigh into those debates. But Keogh's, I'm told, from Labor Party people is the best pint in Dublin. Okay. There you go.
I'll note that for next time.
Good stuff. Okay, let's get into it. So it's the 3rd budget for the Albanese government. And before we sort of look towards this particular upcoming budget, I kind of want to get both of your perspectives on where the Australian economy stands as it is. And if you want to draw back on some of the things that were in the last budget and how that has put the where is the budget right now going into this new one, or certainly the things that have happened since the last budget? I'm keen to get your reflections on that as well. But sort of where is it performing well? Where are there areas of concern that needs to be addressed? So let's sort of set the scene, and I'll go to you, Emma, first. Where do you think the Australian economy stands as it is right now, heading into this particular budget season?
It's performing better than a lot of economies overseas, but the problems are structural in our economy, and they've been there for a long time. And what we're seeing, of course, is what always happens when Labor comes to power federally, is they come into power when all the shit's just hit the fan, and they have to try and clean it up. So I think what we've seen in the first couple of years of this government is very steady management of the economy, very what would be really lauded if it was under a Liberal government by the Murdoch press, right? We've had a surplus, we're on track for another one. Those things were incredibly important to the right-wing media for a long time. Suddenly they don't seem to be anymore, which is interesting. Federal surpluses are fetishised in this country, and they shouldn't be. But if there is ever a time to maintain a surplus, it's when we've got an inflation problem like the one we've got now and that we've been living in for the last 2 years. So you've got to give Jim Chalmers a lot of credit, actually, for keeping a very and Katie Gallagher too, of course, she's in the Dr. No position in the finance ministry, for keeping a really firm hand on the spending requests from their cabinet colleagues, because they are huge. There's after 12, nearly a decade of really poor mismanagement of the economy, even through a crisis, when the previous government did spend money, they spent it in all the wrong places, and that's no doubt contributed to the inflation problem we've got now. So while there will be calls on, and there are calls on social media, this is meant to be a Labor government, why are they running a surplus when they could be spending it and helping people? You splash too much of that money out back into an overheated economy, you make it worse for a lot of people. So I think the first thing I want to say is well done on holding the line, on maintaining some, budget integrity and discipline. But, and it's a big but, and the Treasurer said this himself, these surpluses are transitory. The budget is in long-term structural deficit. And in order to do the things that people elect Labor governments to do, we are going to have to invest more in the economy. And that means we're going to have to shift the tax and transfer mix quite significantly over coming years. The challenge of genuine tax reform, genuine economic reform, is only going to get more pressing as time goes on. So this is a pre-election budget. I don't expect to see a lot of tax reform in this budget, but I hope it will set the stage for a sensible conversation nationally with the crossbench as well, about what we need to do in the years ahead to ensure we've got the resources to fund the services that we need and to fund a more equal society for people, housing, job opportunities in the new economy. All those things take investment, and it needs the government to lead that investment.
Ed, do you want to build on some of those reflections from Emma about where we are right now?
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with all of that. I think, I was thinking about this, look back, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, whenever it was, when, it's basically straight on 2 years now that they took power. And if you looked at the sort of state of the economy now from then, you'd be pretty happy. When Labor took office, we had inflation running at 7.8% or whatever it was, wage growth at 2.5% or so, like this real challenge. Now, inflation is still a little bit too high. The mean trimmed inflation is 4% or whatever it is. But we have seen a return to real wages growth, which is really positive. A couple of budget surpluses. These are good. This is a pretty good situation. We've still got a very strong labour market. There's a lot of things to celebrate there. We're also sort of in this moment where I think, this is still kind of a cost of living budget. We're in this, still in the midst of a cost of living crisis, but it feels like the sort of emergency moment of the cost of living question has sort of moved on a little bit, in the sense that there seems to be less talk about, I guess, kind of emergency support measures regarding cost of living, and more what Jim Chalmers called, relief and reform, figuring out a way that the spending that they do has some sort of medium, longer term structural benefit, whether maybe not for the budget necessarily, but for various sort of social and economic ills. So I think they're going into this budget in a strong position. I think, recently we've seen they did want inflation to come down lower. We had a lot of conversation around there was going to be interest rate cuts later in this year. That sort of moved on. So that probably changes a little bit of the political calculus over the next 6 or 9 months or so. But generally speaking, I think, look, we're in a strong position. There are still these sort of, despite the good news, there are a lot of people in the country that are certainly doing it very, very difficult. We're having this problem with, people even in the labour market, really struggling to get by. And I think part of the balancing act in this budget is not just providing the right support for people, but also genuinely empathising about the plight that a lot of people have in the country and not being too triumphalist about the good news. We've seen, particularly in the US, I think, too much triumphalism from the Biden administration about how good and how strong the economy is, even though that headline data might be something to support and celebrate. You need to sort of pay genuine respect and empathy towards the challenges that people are facing. So that's kind of what I'm going to be looking at the next few days.
Excellent opening salvo. So I do want to talk about the surplus in a moment, but before we do that, I just want to get a sense from both of you about the stage 3 tax cut announcements that were made a while back. How significant is that in changing the goalposts for this year's budget? Like, if that didn't happen, what would Jim Chalmers be in a different sort of position heading into this budget? Emma, to you first.
For sure. And, I was banging on about these tax cuts from the day they were announced by Morrison when he was Treasurer. And scrapping them was never going to be politically feasible. What Chalmers came down with in the end was really good redesign of those tax cuts to ensure that they actually did return bracket creep to middle income earners effectively, and they do that now. They if they had gone into this budget with those tax cuts as they were, $8,000 for someone on 200 grand, nothing for someone on 50. And let's remember, stage 1 and 2 has largely been repealed because they were temporary offsets rather than permanent cuts. He would have been facing a real problem of having to pump a lot more money into households through direct spending than taxing in order to manage the inequity of that. People see them come in on the 1st of July. There would have been real pain and real anger about that. And doing it through a tax cut is less inflationary, actually, than just giving people a one-off payment or increasing, direct benefits to households. The energy bill relief has been done very cleverly. That's really not inflationary at all. But the tax cuts, the change of the tax cuts was essential. I think it took too long to get there, but we got there because the community attitude had shifted, right? And that goes to all of the people that joined per capita eventually in the campaign to change them. When it became obvious that the electorate understood what was going on and just how few people were going to benefit and the cost of living pressure on people, then the momentum for change became irresistible, and that's when we saw them act. But I think, you have to give credit to the Treasurer's office in particular here, who never gave up on that, who always made the argument that we needed to be, that they were inherently regressive the way they were, and that they needed to be reformed. Having said that, they're not tax reform, right? They're just tax cuts. And effectively, if we had indexed tax brackets, these kinds of cuts wouldn't be announced every few years because we just have an indexation that made sure that our tax system kept up with bracket creep. Important thing to do. Thank you for doing it. It's finally allowed me to be able to move on and look at other issues. But I think what it does show is that when you're willing to do something that's what people expect of a Labor government, of being fairer, then they'll accept that happily. There was very little. It was done cleverly as well. It was very hard for the opposition to oppose it. Susan Lee gave it her best go, but it really didn't work.
Yeah, they were scrambling.
Yeah. So I hope what it does is give some sense to those in caucus and cabinet that are more nervous about bolder tax reform, that if you bring people with you and explain why you're doing it and demonstrate that it's better for the most people and better for the country, it can be done. So kudos. Thank God you did it. Thank you for doing it. But I hope it's just the first step towards some real bold tax reform in a next term of an Albanese government.
It's an interesting point you raised there. I want to go to you, Ed. The boldness of this government. They seemed very hesitant to make this announcement for a very, very long time. What's your thoughts about the, I don't want to use the word courage, but just the way that they're behaving in this sort of this certainty or uncertainty about decisions they want to make in this space?
Well, with stage 3, there was certainly a lot of pressure for them to change, and absolute kudos for everyone doing that, including yourself, Emma. Like it was absolutely necessary to put that pressure on. I think when they ended up announcing it made sense. They had this really challenging end to last year. They went into this year. They really changed the narrative and did kind of catch the opposition on the back foot. Didn't really know how to argue against it. What it has done, and exactly like Emma was saying, this is really the marquee cost of living feature of the budget that people will feel, and it is sizable enough for people earning above a median income or around a median income to really actually feel the difference in a monthly, weekly, fortnightly paycheck, whatever it is. So it limited the pressure on them to do all these other sort of cash splashes that you might otherwise see in this moment. So, and I think it still is a relatively brave choice. They had to, overtly abandon and discard a promise. And the way that they did that was not just by, doing it recklessly. They came up with something better, and that made it impossible to argue against. So it was I think it was overdue. I'm extremely glad it happened. But the way they went about it was very clever, and it's given them breathing room, I think, going into this budget.
Can we talk about I guess the sort of, I think this is the central question about this budget. We touched on it last week on the episode of the Feeney Files with David Feeney and Rebecca Thistleton, actually, from McKell. Your colleague Ed joined us. We talked about the sort of goal of this budget. Does the Treasurer keep spending down in the hopes that the RBA drops the interest rates before the election, or do they use some of this surplus to spend to support where the voters are struggling with the cost of living? But then that puts pressure on. It could be seen as inflationary, which would then mean the RBA will just not touch interest rates. Sticking with you, Ed, what are your thoughts on what Jim Chalmers does here?
Yeah, I think that we'll be trying to thread the needle with a modest surplus. I think I'm not sure what that will look like, what the extent of that will be. But I think, as I was saying, the stage 3 changes is really a sort of marquee cost of living measure. There's huge amounts of other areas of budgetary pressure in the longer term, NDIS, AUKUS, all these sort of other big spending commitments that are kind of lurking. But they're going into an election year. They want to demonstrate this consistent economic responsibility and management. And you have to excuse me, there's a street sweeper out the side of my house, as always is the case when you're doing a podcast. But so I think they'll still be pursuing the approach that they have had in the last couple of budgets. And they want to make the argument that, they've the thread of the needle between sensible economic management and genuinely addressing cost of living pressures. I don't think that's going to change here. And I don't think you're going to expect to see some sort of huge additional new spending commitments beyond what has already been signalled.
Emma, I'm just trying to think of the calendar here right now. This may actually be the last budget before the next election.
I think Albanese flagged when he was last asked about this, he tends to go full term, but there may be a mini budget in March or April next year. But yeah, this is the last likely full, regular May budget. But of course, there's MyEFO in October, November, and they almost certainly will do a mini budget if they're going to go to the polls 12 months from now, I would think. But yeah, it's critically important in terms of setting up, what have we achieved? I think traditionally you'd say third budget, second real budget. The first was a sort of mini just after coming to office budget. But what have we done? This is the tenor of this Labor government, and what are we going to do next? And that's the context in which it's being handed down. But, and there's a big but, no first-term Labor government no first-term government in Australia has picked up seats at its second election in 100 years. Labor only has a margin of 2 seats. So they're very much heading into the election with a lot of weight in those bags in terms of, are we going to hold on to the 4 seats we picked up in WA? Likely not. Are we going to pick up any seats in Queensland? We'll need to if we're going to lose some in WA. Redistributions that make it unclear whether a seat or 2 might go in Victoria and New South Wales. And then you've got the Greens coming really hard at some of those inner city seats. So there is, I think there's a great column in today's 9 papers by Sean Kelly, my friend Sean, who used to work in the Rudd and Gillard governments, and where he talks about this, the question that you originally put. This has been a cautious, fairly steady government so far. And I think at some point that becomes difficult for them when they're heading into an election where they actually need to almost treat it like they're coming from opposition. If they're going to pick up seats and maintain a majority, then people need to be given a reason to vote Labor, not just not to vote for the opposition. And some of the things we're seeing, like the changes to HECS indexation that was announced today, for example, they're good, they're sensible moves, but they're going to be told they're not enough by a lot of the pressure that's coming from the left. So I think it's a particularly challenging environment going into an election year for a government that doesn't have a huge majority and wants to say, look at the good things we've done. And they have done a lot of good things. They've done a lot of good things that don't get nearly enough credit. And for those people in the welfare lobby, for example, who just say they're as bad as the other lot, well, tell that to any single mum who's reliant on welfare and now has single parenting payment till their child's 14. To people in this, we've seen more spending on social housing than we have in the last 30 years. So, but enough is going to be the cry from the left, and yet from the right, you've already got the Murdoch papers going, they can't intervene in the economy this way, they're spending too much. So your question is really pertinent. If they were to keep spending, they've exhausted just about every option they've got for spending to give some households some relief without it becoming inflationary at this point, right? There's been a 35% increase to the base rate of income support over the last 4 years, if you include the previous government's changes as well. There've been direct investment in energy relief for housing. The tax cuts are there. If they were to come out now with a huge package of household relief in some way, and it's hard to see other than those mechanisms what's left, then you would be almost certainly putting the pressure on inflation that would mean you would not see that rate cut before the next election. And 60% of people in this country either own their home outright or are paying a mortgage. They don't necessarily want to see, that is important relief for the 33% of people with a mortgage. If you were to say, well, we'll give more money to Commonwealth rent assistance, for example, that's probably going to push rents up and be inflationary on the likelihood of further interest rate cuts. So it is a really tricky balancing act. And I think those people that are saying more at this stage in the electoral cycle need to understand that making sure the economy doesn't blow up one way or the other, we don't see inflation massively go up and interest rates start rising again, or that we see wages to start falling and unemployment going up. Both bad outcomes for the community as well as for the current government.
Ed, keen to get your thoughts on that the budget as a political document, because as Emma outlines there, they're electorally, it's a very fine line for Labor in this next election. And so you would think normally this budget would be a budget that would be like, here are the target demographics or audiences in these specific seats that we need to win and woo to ensure that they vote for the Labor Party. How are they going to manage to do that whilst not putting, creating inflationary pressure or fucking up the economy or just shit public policy? Because right now we should be actually just having a budget that says to middle class voters, we got you and we need you to vote for us in the next election.
Yeah. Well, we talked about stage 3, but one of the geniuses of that is they can literally go to every single person in the country who has a job and say, here's something directly, tangibly for you personally. And people will feel that. So that creates a whole bunch of space to not have basically alleviates pressure in other ways which you might otherwise feel. When Labor took office, you have to, there's still this sort of reputational challenge for Labor governments federally around economic management, around, are they going to, go crazy and spend too much, do this and that. And, part of the challenge for them from day one has been to demonstrate their credentials to, mainstream Australia, that they know what they're doing. And I still think that's core to their pitch for re-election. It's, when we contrast their approach to governing to what the opposition are proposing at the moment, the radicals are the opposition. Like, they literally have two core policies, one around nuclear energy and super for housing. Like, that's like their two biggest policies. These are radical, expensive, kind of often unpopular ideas that are controversial and, sort of somewhat reckless. So there's space there just in middle Australia for the Labor government to, yes, alleviate legitimate cost of living pressures, but also demonstrate, we are actually the adults in the room, and reset some of that narrative for the medium term. And I think that, that's not as sexy sometimes as doing some other things here and there, but that's pretty sound politics if you're trying to set up a government for the long term.
I want to talk about priorities, and if I can start with you, Emma, what do you think we've fit around the edges here, but let's get straight into it. What do you think some are the key priorities with your per capita hat on that should be in this budget? And then I'll get Ed to jump in on some of those from the McKell perspective, and then we can maybe sort of just move through some of those things collectively. But starting with you, can you set the scene? What do you think some of those key priorities are for the budget?
So obviously we've seen announcements over the weekend and today on changing indexation for HECS, but also some bursaries or stipends to students completing degrees in nursing, teaching, social work, midwifery, something we've been fighting really hard for. Very happy to see that. And that points to, I think this is going to be the first iteration of Jason Clare's response to the Universities Accord. I think education and opportunity for young people is going to be a really important theme in this budget, because really when you look at what's happening on the pressure that's coming from the left and this whole issue of generational inequality, what we're talking about is the loss of social mobility and the loss of opportunity, and the feeling amongst a generation of people in this country that no matter what they do, they can't build as good a life as their parents did. I think that will be a strong theme in this budget, and if it isn't, it should be, and it should be the entire theme for the next election. So I think that spending in the education space is good. The Minister said this morning that's not all they're going to do, but I think it's an important first indication. And I think then that theme needs to go more broadly to look at what is the next economy? What are we setting up for the next generation of Australians? And the Future Made in Australia idea goes to that. We haven't seen a lot of policy detail on that front yet, but we are seeing it pull in a lot of the investment vehicles and things that the government has already set up, like the National Reconstruction Fund, Rewiring Australia, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation's new remits and so on. And what that is, for all that the Judith Sloans of the world are having conniptions over protectionism, is really just a very sensible and long overdue recognition that the government needs to shape the next economy, that this is the biggest disruption to our economy probably since the Industrial Revolution. More so, I would say, than the internet and computing revolution, because that was largely positive in terms of productivity. There are risks as well as opportunities here. So I think that this budget has to be and will be very much focused on what's the purpose of government in playing a role in building the economy of the future. Because as we decarbonise, a lot of what this country has relied upon for its prosperity will no longer be viable. A lot of those fossil fuel exports will decline, whether people want them to or not, and I certainly do. And so I think this budget will be very much about saying what is the role of government in establishing the framework by which people can build a good life, not a handout government as such, but removing a lot of the barriers that we've put in place of young people, addressing those fears that people have that not only will there not be a healthy planet to live on, but I won't have a decent job in it and I won't be able to afford a home. And so I think this budget has to be very much about how we are helping you to thrive, how we are continuing the great Labor tradition of taking moments of great disruption, whether that was the Second World War or the challenges of the economic crisis of the 1970s, and recreating an economy that is fit for the times. And that's what I see Chalmers talking about very much. He's being relentlessly compared to his mentor, Paul Keating, at the moment, often unfavourably by the right-wing press. I think that's deeply unfair, because what Chalmers has is a grasp of the current challenges and of our place in those challenges in the world. And so this is a really important budget in setting that up. I think the first couple of budgets were rightly focused on people that have been very badly left behind and trying to bring them, back into society to some extent. There's still more to do there, definitely. I'm not suggesting that the rate of job seeker is in any way adequate, but this budget will be very much about building the platform for investment in what comes next and how we can grow in a way that's sustainable and brings the community with it. Restoring hope to people is what it needs to be about.
Very good. There's a whole bunch of things I want to come back to you about that, Emma, in a moment, but I also want to hear from Ed. Ed, you think, with your McKell cap on, what do you think the priorities of this budget need to be?
So just drawing on some of the threads there that Emma was mentioning, I think, and look, I actually don't know what precisely this would look like, but one of the things that you're going to hear more criticism of in terms of the state of the economy generally over the next little while is the productivity problem. We do have a kind of relatively alarming productivity numbers inherent in the economy at the moment. I'm just curious about how they're going to address that, or what they say about that, or if there's new measures or something to address that legitimate problem. Because there's every time we talk about the sort of general positive state of the economy, there's always this, I think reasonable asterisks around it, but we do have productivity issues, etc. So that'll be interesting to see. I still think there is more that the government needs to pursue in housing. Not that there hasn't been a huge amount already done and said, and there's seen the HAF and other big, significant commitments in previous budgets. These are all good things. But I worry about the conversation and the argument kind of being lost, despite all Labor governments having all of the levers at their disposal around the country to do some really significant things, particularly on social housing. There has been, a great deal of additional investment over the past few years into the social housing sector. I just still think there's much more room to do it and do it proudly. We have a Prime Minister that grew up in social housing. There's still a sense and a caution, maybe not so much within, I'm not speaking personally about anyone within the Labor government, but just in generally in society, in some circles you meet, they don't really want to see money allocated towards social housing as much as it should be, because potentially it looks like you're giving something away to people that shouldn't be, etc. We need to see more of a focus towards key worker housing as well. I think that's a serious space that we're just not really talking about in any meaningful way yet, in terms of, I haven't actually seen much policy on that so far. So I think there's still territory for Labor to come out and be a bit more aggressive and a bit more ambitious on social housing, key worker housing, that sort of space. So that's what I'd love to see a lot more of. We did a budget submission a few months ago, and it was sort of filled with, little bits and pieces, ideas, things that weren't going to be too expensive. One of the ones that I've always liked that we've pursued for quite a few years at McKell is this idea of social emergency lending, basically trying to use the government balance sheet to crush payday lenders, which I think are just this social ill. They're a really sort of at times nefarious actors, and a lot of lower income Australians often depend on payday lenders just to, their washing machine breaks down and they go to them and they get stuck in debt spirals. I think there's a way to address that particular problem. That's a kind of small idea. That's a personal policy that I like. I'd like to see something in that regard as well. But yeah, those bigger questions around productivity and around seriously trying to win this housing argument, I think I'll be interested to see where there's more in those spaces.
So pardon my ignorance, Ed, I didn't realise that productivity was an issue in this country. I always assumed since we changed the way that industrial relations worked in this country, part of the reason why we went into bargaining at an enterprise was to increase productivity. Where is productivity not doing its heavy lifting in the Australian economy? Tell me like I'm a 3-year-old.
The productivity number, well, Emma, you feel free to jump in. You probably ought to sort of articulate this more, and I'm not a productivity expert, but effectively we've basically seen sort of flatlining or reversing productivity in recent years. There's kind of, the productivity argument, I think, has often been won by the Conservatives because they effectively say if we want a more productive economy, just completely deregulate the labour market. And then we'll have more output for less input in labour, and bang, there we suddenly solved productivity generally. I think I want to see a kind of more front foot progressive idea of building a productive economy, and that means looking at ways to facilitate change and investment in new technology and innovation and all of this sort of stuff in a way that sort of brings people along. Like, if in theory you suddenly Uberize the entire economy and you had every single person working on gig contracts, technically our productivity numbers would be higher because you'd be paying like just the equation of productivity, like, labor cost v output would be improved and the numbers would look better. But wouldn't that just be a terrible outcome for every single person? So we need to figure out a way to kind of be on the front foot with a more progressive, more worker friendly vision of what a productive economy looks like. And there's a huge amount of stuff to do there. We're, talking about future economy stuff, the rise of AI and all this sort of technological transformation in the economy is it means we need to rethink things like redundancy and worker protections generally and transitions between jobs and all that sort of stuff. So and that needs to be framed in a way of like enabling and encouraging a productive economy. So I think I just think that the conservative criticism, or if you read any AFR column, like the big asterisk on the economy is always productivity, and I think there's still territory there to demonstrate that that's being addressed.
Yeah, I think,
Emma, I'm keen on your thoughts because you're grinning away there as talking about that.
I'll be quick. I think, yes, productivity is a challenge, but it's the decline or the flatlining of productivity has a culprit, and it is not the workforce. Labour productivity is pretty good in this country, always has been. It's business investment that's been missing. And if you look at Australia, is no different than other English-speaking developed countries in recent years. When business has made profit, it has ploughed that profit back into itself. It is engaged in share buybacks or executive bonuses. It has not invested in productivity enhancing technologies or new ways of working. That's a bigger problem in Australia than it is in more complex economies because we have such a relatively small pool of big earning industries. So when those industries don't invest, and there's such a huge proportion of our economy, then our productivity drops very quickly. So, for example, a lot of the productivity gains in mining have been gained. There's not a lot more we can do to automate mining. They're not big employers anymore. They use technology to drive their profits, but they're not reinvesting those back into people. Another part of the challenge is the fastest growing area of our economy is services. Something like 65-75% of us now work in services, and they're notoriously difficult to measure in terms of our traditional productivity measures. So my view is a little different to the productivity commissions. I don't think that it's the lack of productivity of services that's bringing our measurement of productivity down. I think it's that we don't measure the productivity of services adequately. So the way you traditionally do is how many hours of a worker's time does it take to make a widget? And then the more widgets you can make in an hour, the more productive you are. Services don't work like that. So, a great example is the previous chair of the Productivity Commission came out a couple of years ago, maybe not even that long ago, and said there have been no productivity gains in the early childhood education and care sector for 20 years, completely ignoring the rise in women's workforce participation that would not be possible without the early childhood education and care sector. So we look at productivity in a very siloed way. And in services, we actually need to take a much more holistic, integrated look at the way those services enhance our lives, because the guy that's going to make the widgets in the factory can't do that if there's no one feeding him or maintaining his home. We don't count that kind of work. So there's going to be a challenge as we move into the post-carbon economy, where we will maintain having a high proportion of service sector jobs. How we not just enhance the productivity of those jobs. So people will talk about using machines in aged care, for example. That might not be the outcome that people want in personal care, but measuring that productivity more completely and how it contributes to our well-being as a nation. The other side of this, of course, is you'll get the same people saying we want to see productivity growth that will be poo-pooing the government's Made in Australia approach, because they don't think the government should do anything to intervene in the economy. But at the same time, they'll say the economy is moribund and there's no productivity growth, business isn't investing, but they object to government doing anything that might give business the certainty to invest, like, setting a carbon price or, basic things like that. So there comes a point where you have to call these people out and say, well, you've been whinging about the economy for over a decade, but whenever anyone suggests doing something different, you say, oh, no, don't interfere. Don't interfere in the market. The market is not producing these outcomes that we need now, particularly with the challenge of decarbonising. So, intervention in the market needs to be made in a way, and I think the Treasurer has been pretty clear that it will be invested in a way that will enhance productivity and grow the pie, but also look at the distribution of that pie.
Emma, can I pick up on some of your initial remarks in terms of where you want to see priorities? I think you were talking about this sort of restructuring of the Australian economy, and you talked about this sort of post-carbon world that we're moving to. I guess my question to you is, if you were the Treasurer going into this budget, knowing how close it is to the election, is this the time to start to introduce some of the things that you'd want to see in terms of restructuring the economy, or is that something you just wait until let's win the next term and then right off the bat in that next budget after you've been re-elected to start to restructure it? And where would you begin with that kind of, because I'm conscious of that. I want to ask you through the lens of moving to more renewables and all that kind of stuff, because we're starting to see things happen, right? There's an attitudinal change, I think, in the public. Now is the time, obviously, to really double down on it. But would you do it now, or would you wait until next term?
You start now, but you don't introduce big changes until the next. So my response to all of the community organisations that we work with, etc., is you're not going to see major tax reform in this budget. It is something that needs to be explained, have the community come along, and then be delivered as part of a legitimate agenda. Now, does that mean I think this government's going to be bold enough to take a 2019 style Bill Shorten tax reform package to the next election? No, I don't think. I think they've learned that lesson too. But I do think what this budget needs to do is soften the ground in a way, and that's what's happening. The announcement around the future Made in Australia been shot down because it's being framed in a very populist way. People like to hear that we're going to make things here. It's actually also the right thing to do. So it's getting the politics right as well as the policy. There's no way I would go into this budget if I were the Treasurer and say, oh, guess what, we're going to dump a whole heap of tax reform on your head without announcement, and then we'll see how you like that in the next election. That's not how it's done. What we do need to see, though, is the kind of and let's make a comparison here. Albanese said he wants to be more like the Hawke government than any other. Chalmers is being compared to Keating all the time. Of course, they held a big tax summit in 1985 that enabled them then to make some pretty significant changes to the economy. They didn't do that in their first term. They made that a kind of centrepiece of the middle of their administration. But if you look at who went to that tax summit and how successful it was, you'd be very hard pressed to put something like that on today and have the same buy-in across the economy, because you'd instantly be shouted down, it's a stunt on the right or it's not enough on the left. It's harder today to do those things than it was 40 years ago. That doesn't mean you don't try. It means you have to do it in a much more cautious way, particularly given the high numbers on the crossbench that are, almost certainly going to increase at the next election. So no, I don't expect to see them come out and make big changes to taxes. They may do something on negative gearing, perhaps, to make it a supply issue. I hope they do, but I'm not holding my breath for that. But I actually do believe that changes to the taxation settings around housing need to be part of a bigger look at tax, because negative gearing doesn't just apply to property investment, right? It applies to all kinds of investment. So does the capital gains tax discount. We've got a whole heap of taxation settings now that are contributing to what Ken Henry has called it a generational tragedy. And they are actually creating a society of haves and have-nots. So my view would be, in this budget, you point to what's been done so far. This is a government that is seeking to bring people, back up into society that have been marginalised, that we have looked at all different sides of the economy. We're not acting recklessly in one regard, we're just pumping money in over here without worrying about inflation over there. We are, as Ed said, the grown-ups. We're the ones that can be trusted. But in order to build the kind of consensus that's needed for big economic reform, and that was built in the 1980s, despite the opposition of the then, of the coalition at the time. They like to pretend it was all bipartisan. It wasn't. But they built a coalition in the community. In order to do that, you've got to proceed as cautiously as this government has been, while flagging an intention to create a new economy that is going to serve people. And you'll notice I'm not using words like reform that much, because people are sick of that. You want to talk about investment instead of spending, about creating opportunity instead of reforming the system. We've focused, the reason, as you said, that the community attitude shifted, Stephen, towards action on climate change is because of a very deliberate move by the ALP over the last 3 to 4 years of talking about the opportunities rather than the threats, of talking about what challenges we can meet and what benefits they will bring, rather than, you're all going to lose your jobs and the planet's going to burn. So it's a framing exercise, and this budget's really critical in setting off that framing.
I want to come back to Ed in a minute, but I'm not going to ask this question of Ed because it would be unfair since he's across the border. But just as a counter argument to that consensus, how much consensus do you think the Andrews government did over the time that they were in, that he was running this show, and their economic agenda? Like, I don't get a sense that there was much of that. They had an idea and they just went and did it. Yep. Why? What do you think about that as an idea for the Albanese government? Just going, you know what, we've got elected and we're going to use this time wisely. Let's get cracking.
It's harder federally for a start. So
why?
For a start, states are. Sorry.
So I was just going to jump in. I mean, Labor dominate in Victoria, and they don't federally. They're inherently much more vulnerable. So it's harder to be that. So to have that degree of bang, here we go, like crash through, we'll be fine anyway.
Labor had government in Victoria in 2014 by 3 seats.
Yeah. No, you're right, Stephen. But the point I want to make is state governments are elected for service delivery, right? So when you say, I'm going to do this because it's what people want, they'll give you a lot more slack to do that, because they are electing you to deliver things. The federal government is seen as basically managing the economy and then providing the money for states to deliver things. And so there's this kind of, Australian voters are pretty clever, right? They go, well, maintain the economy really safely up here, keep all the money, and then the states can do what they want. There's an element of that states get away with being bolder because people want them to do things. When the federal government says we're going to do things, people get worried about that because they see it wrongly, in my view, as interfering in the market. There's also, as Ed pointed to, Victoria is a very progressive state. We've got a smaller landmass. We're much more culturally homogenous, not in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of our, view of the role of government, etc. You only have to look at how Victoria compared in referendum votes over the last few years to Queensland or WA to see the difference. But you also we do have the Herald Sun in Victoria. We do have commercial radio, but they're not nearly as rabid. Herald Sun may be an exception, but radio is not nearly as rabid as in other parts of the country. Our version of a shock jock has now it's Tom Elliott down here. That he's actually fairly moderate for a right winger. So it is. But having said that, yes, I share your frustration. I think the federal government could go harder on some things, but it's easy for us to say that from, the People's Republic of Melbourne, isn't it? It's, we're in a part of the world I've done.
And also, we've got a year until the election, and they want to bring people along for that journey. We say if they were going to do more on super profits tax or on negative gearing or something like that, you need to dominate the argument and make kind of like what they've done with the stage 3. They've kind of made it watertight and made arguing against the changes that they made kind of seem a bit silly, and you can't just thrust that upon people without, I think, a serious campaign to bring people along for the journey. One of the big, I'm a big fan of his, and I'm sure we all are, but Andrew Leigh has been such an effective minister in that they're actually doing some really interesting reforms, and he's doing all this work on non-compete clauses at the moment. And their whole approach is, they're changing some pretty significant things, but really genuinely doing it in a consultative way, bringing people along, making it kind of seem like a logical place to end up, instead of just doing it, without ensuring that those bases are covered. So I think if we saw any more ambition on big tax reform stuff, then it's going to be part of a pretty concerted, obvious process, and not necessarily just thrust upon us in a budget.
But my question is then, and this is more moving to the sort of the realm of political communication. I know that we talk about, Sydney radio and Brisbane radio, shock jocks and all that kind of stuff. I think they're just as rabid in Victoria. I think the difference is that they were manipulated better by the state government. And I think they kind of got in their heads. Former Premier Andrews never went on Steve Price. He never went on, who was the other bloke? Neil Mitchell. I almost forgot his name. Albo likes going on to those shows. He goes on Ben Fordham. I don't know why he goes on Ben Fordham to talk about The Voice.
Because if you don't go on Ben Fordham in Sydney, you're not talking to half the audience. It is different.
I don't think people are listening to Ben Fordham. All the evidence that we're seeing is that people are getting their media from a far more fragmented way than they were 10 years ago. And I just don't think that talkback radio has any impact on the voters that we need to go after. I think a bunch of Tories are listening to Ben Fordham and they're getting what they want. We've all gone into our little silos. But I think that there are other ways in which we can communicate.
You're making a good point. I think that actually a lot of this fear is a hangover from the experience of the last federal government to some extent, I don't think it's just because Dan didn't go on Neil Mitchell that they don't have much play in Victoria. I mean, shock jocks have never been particularly successful in Victoria right through my adult life. But yes, I mean, you asked us why they don't do it. This is why. There's a fear, and there's a big caucus up there. There's 77 in the lower house and a bunch of senators, and amongst them all there are people that are still genuinely scarred by the Rudd-Gillard years and genuinely terrified of the power of the Murdoch and the tabloid press. I think, like you, they're not keeping up with the changes enough. So if you look at young people in particular, why are we losing all these votes to the Greens? Because they don't give a damn what's written in the media. When the Greens housing policy came out, I was asked to write an analysis of it for the 9 papers, and I couldn't find much good to say about it at all, based on a pure policy analysis. I tried to put my partisanship aside because I want to see a non-market developer in the public, building social housing. But that didn't cut through to the Green support base because they don't read the 9 papers. They're on TikTok and, they're on international media sites where they hear about, wiping student debt being a big issue for millennials. Well, it is in America. It's not as big an issue here as it's been portrayed. So yes, you're right. They are more afraid than they need to be. But when you've got a majority of 2 and you've got to balance the needs of people in Brunswick with the demands of people in Kalgoorlie, you have to tread a slightly different line. I would like to see a bit more of the old fighting Tories elbow along the Dan Andrews line as well. And I think, we see flashes of that occasionally, and it's a good thing. It's still there. But the national media is a difficult beast still, and there's still also at the traditional media level many journalists that are senior in the 9 papers, in the ABC, even in Guardian Australia, who still operate in that paradigm where what's on the front page of the Oz is going to dictate the political agenda for the day. It's breaking down, but it's going to take time, and that kind of PTSD that a lot of the current cabinet have from the Rudd-Gillard years. Man, I've still got a bit myself, and I was just a lowly staffer, so I can only imagine how they.
In the words of Frank Herbert, fear is the mind killer. That's what I always think. So, just get into them. Final thoughts before we wrap up, and obviously we'll talk to you two wonderful people in a week's time. Starting with you, Ed, what are your final reflections before we head into this budget?
Look, I'm interested in what we're going to see rolled out over the next week. With those couple of announcements we talked about, HEX, the HEX changes, the prac payments, they kind of really reflect the kind of practical yet not incredibly expensive ways of kind of appeasing the moment a little bit while doing some productive, important things. I'm just curious, really, what we're going to see over the next week or so. But other than that, let's just see what happens. I'm looking forward to talking about it. The day after the budget? I'll have to wrap my head around the papers pretty quick.
I hope we've given you enough time, because I'm assuming you're both going to be in the lock up room. Is that what they call it?
I'm not actually. But,
oh wow!
Yeah, but I'll be control effing on the.
Very good.
Margaret Mackenzie's going in for per capita. When you've got Margaret Mackenzie on your team, you don't try and do the budget lock up yourself. You defer to the expertise. She's been doing it for decades. So, but yeah, we'll be prepared for the next one. But yeah, my concluding thoughts. I am thrilled with today's announcement on paid placements for students, and that includes social work students. I was up in Canberra in March with the ASU and the Students to End Placement Poverty to do a big push on that. So really pleased with that. I think the HEX changes are sensible. I also want to give a shout out to the announcement a couple of weeks ago from Katie Gallagher that we will see superannuation on paid parental leave, something that we worked with the late, great Linda White on that issue when she was at the ASU back in 2017. So a fitting tribute to Linda there. They're the early things that are released that are good news. There'll be more good news on the night. They always save up a couple of big announcements, so look forward to what's there. But yeah, it is a scene-setting budget, and I think if we want to see a bit of that boldness, it's there. It's there in this approach to a future made in Australia, and it's a big deal reclaiming the role of government in industry policy. Let's not ignore that just because Joe Biden's done it. The gnashing of teeth at the Oz and the AFR when that came out shows you what a big shift that is. And so, yeah, I'm as always, Stephen, optimistic. Couldn't do the job if I were.
Ed Cavanough and Emma Dawson, thank you so much for your time today. Enjoy your budget evening. I'm sure it's kind of like the grand final for you guys. And I look forward to talking to you next week as we sort of unpack what is in the third budget for this Labor government.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.